Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Zululand, Professor Mtose, members of Council online, members of the University Management, deans of faculties, members of academic and support staff, students, ladies and gentlemen, and most importantly, our distinguished guest, Professor Lelwani Ramugondo, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Transformation, Student Affairs and Social Responsiveness at the University of Cape Town. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this year's first Vice-Chancellor's Public Lecture webinar series. By way of introduction, I think it is opportune for me to situate the Vice-Chancellor's Public Lecture series within its context. The series should be seen as the university's commitment to truth-telling. Truth-telling requires us to embark on a scholarship of revelation versus the scholarship of concealment. Universities are, by definition, social institutions. They are established as extensions of their societies. To that end, they tend to reflect the aspirations and the maladies of their societies. In this regard, they are expected to be at the forefront of identifying and resolving the challenges of their own societies. In the foreword of Prof.'s book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Richard Shaw eloquently writes, and I quote, "There is no such thing as a neutral education process. Education either functions as an instrument that is used to facilitate the integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring conformity to it, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world." Unquote. Consistent with its policy of racial segregation, the apartheid government saddled us with the burden of having what is called today historically black and historically white universities. The way in which these universities were funded also reflected the policy intentions of the apartheid government. This policy found expression in the words of the then Minister of Bantu Education, the main architect of apartheid policy, Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd, who later became the Prime Minister. Verwoerd did not beat about the bush, and he said, and I quote again, "When I have control of native education, I will reform it so that the natives will be taught from childhood to realize that equality with Europeans is not for them. There is no place for him, the black child, in a European society above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching a Bantu child mathematics when it cannot use it in practice?" Unquote. This policy intention was to express itself in how the universities were established, governed, and funded. Regarding this, Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, former professor and director of the Center for African Studies at the University of Cape Town, wrote, and I quote, "Both the white and the black universities were products of apartheid, though in different ways. The difference was not only in the institutional culture, that the former enjoyed institutional autonomy and the latter were bureaucratically driven. The difference was also in their intellectual horizons. It was the white intelligentsia that took the lead in creating apartheid enforced identities in the knowledge they produced, believing that this was an act of intellectual creativity unrelated to the culture of privilege in which they were steeped. They ended defending an ingrained prejudice with studied conviction. The irony is that the white intelligentsia came to be a greater, became a willing prisoner of apartheid thought than its black counterpart. Elsewhere, Mamdani paraphrases this by saying that many of the institutions in South Africa became nothing more than the detention centers of African thought. In his description of white universities, he says the white institutions proved to be and continue to be slaughterhouses for black talent. It is within this context that one must understand the policy intention of the South Africa's democratic government. The policy prescription, as expressed in the white paper, is deliberately titled A Program for Transformation of Higher Education System. It is envisaged within this policy that a transformed higher education system will do two things. One, it will promote equity of access and fair chances of success to all who are seeking to realize their potential through higher education, while also eradicating all forms of unfair discrimination and advancing redress for past inequalities. And secondly, and most importantly, and relevant for today, that a system that will be transformed will contribute to the advancement of all forms of knowledge and scholarship, and in particular address the diverse problems and demands of the local, national, Southern African, and African context, and uphold rigorous standards of academic quality, unquote. In this, in response to this policy, many universities hurriedly embarked on changing their names, most of them using introducing the word African in both their mission and visions. Some have crafted the most brilliant documents on transformation, but many years later, nothing has changed. For its part, the University of Zululand has taken a bold step of positioning itself as a node for African thought. This positioning is consistent with its mission of fulfilling the centuries long aspirations of African people to establish truly African universities. Indeed, many universities in Africa have remained largely Western university located in Africa. The Vice-Chancellor's public lecture series, under the guidance and leadership of the Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University, Professor Mtose, were established to achieve this vision. Under getting this vision are three strategic goals, which the VC, as soon as she comes here, would be able to elaborate as she also reflects on today's topics of decolonizing the curriculum. The first strategic objective of the university is to ensure that UniZulu becomes a node for African thought. The second objective is to transform the university into a hive of academic activities and intellectual deliberations. So that the university, when you think about it, you think about a place where you say there's a festival of ideas. The last one is that of fast tracking the digitization and the digitalization of the university as part of turning University of Zululand into a smart university. Having provided you with that background about where we are, I now have the pleasure of calling the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Zululand to lay the foundation for today's public lecture that will be delivered by Professor Ramugondo. Professor Mtose, over to you.
University of Zululand Chairperson of Council, Professor David Mabunda, and all members of University Council, to UniZulu executive members, management committee members, deans, deputy deans, staff and students of the University of Zululand, Professor Siepe, chairperson of the session, Professor Brown, my very new deputy vice-chancellor. He will tell you later what is wrong. Congratulations to my deputy vice-chancellor, as the usual, Professor Numlomo and Professor Kunene. Most importantly, our guest speaker for today's webinar, Professor Elelwani Ramugondo, my sister from the University of Cape Town. I greet you all and thank you for joining this webinar online and present here. Molweni, Sanibonani, good morning, Dumaleng, Dimatsoloni Note. First thing, and the first of 2025, Vice-Chancellor Public Lectures or webinar series on our decoloniality journey, which started some 4 years ago, gives us a unique moment where we can look back with a sense of heightened vigilance and fortitude. Therefore, as I welcome you and taking you to this journey of today's lecture of Decolonizing the Curriculum, I have named it Decolonizing the Curriculum, Tensions and Possibilities. I therefore welcome you this morning. I am in constitutive mood, one which is also propelled by lessons drawn from the countless academic contours we have traversed to be where we are today. It's been a long journey, but we are not yet there. That said, I cannot conceal my excitement in anticipation of the privilege to interact with our guest, who will be introduced formally to us, a renowned exponent and practitioner of what Mignolo calls the grammars of decolonization or of change. Program Director Professor Siepe, over these years on decoloniality trajectory, has not only imbued a critical mass of our faculties with growing decolonial perspectives about how to interact and to enact the call to decolonize the curriculum and pedagogy. It also revealed complexities, tensions, and possibilities. These evolve around the conundrum of translating decolonial theory into curricular and pedagogical praxis. As academics who are products of a Eurocentric form of education, it is becoming increasingly clear that alienation that was imposed on us by this type of education and which continues to actively promote coloniality must now be confronted and overcome. Are you willing to overcome? Thank you. In this seminal book, Decolonizing the Mind, Ngugi Waitong speaks of how the colonial education system and the consciousness it inculcated in the African mind had the proverbial effect of emptying the hard disks of the natives, the colonized, of previous memory and downloading into them European memory, thereby inflicting what some scholars call epistemic erasure. Richard, 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, it is against this backdrop that I wish to share with you few reflective issues around today's theme of decolonizing the curriculum. The first set of issues relate to the imperative of intellectual decolonization as an instrument designed to deliver epistemic freedom that facilitates curriculum decolonization. The next, I shall explore how, in spite of such decolonization efforts, coloniality has been shown to survive and mutate. I then posit a holistic approach which questions whether curriculum decolonization can be achieved in isolation of broader contextual conditions. Finally, I end an invitation to embark on continuous search for effective strategies and practices. In terms of intellectual decolonization, is it an antidote for coloniality? As academics committed to undermining coloniality in the curriculum and other spheres of life, we must see ourselves as decolonial intellectuals who have a responsibility to unmask and destroy multiple forms of violence and deception through which coloniality perpetuates itself. In this connection, we learn from decolonial theory that our education system is built out of concepts of practices such as cognitive empire, coloniality of knowledge, amongst others, that function to conceal the intellectual imperialism, and that is alive and hiding in the Eurocentric curriculum. That's what Gajeni Ndlovu says in 2023. Ladies and gentlemen, herein lies the relevance of the perceived antidote called intellectual decolonization, understood as a process that entails a myriad of decolonial interventions. These include 1. Resisting intellectual imperialism of the West by freeing the captive mind from a mode of thinking that lacks independence and relies on Western thought. Point number 2, producing creative intellectuals capable of debunking Western epistemologies, worldviews, as the only valid routes to knowing and promoting epistemic pluriversality by unraveling other epistemologies that are equally valid and which resonate with the lived realities and challenges of people. Deploying intellectual decolonization as a mechanism from confronting the cognitive injustice, a key defining feature of Eurocentric curriculum, however, comes with important caveats that call for a thorough-going theorizing, conceptualization, and reflexivity on the part of academia. Within this line of thinking, Maldonado Torres 2026 proposed the need for theoretical and conceptual clarity and depicted these as powerful weapons for decolonization. In addition to these capacities, Munsavi 2023 stresses the need for decolonial reflexivity in any decolonization praxis and warns that, open quote, if decolonial scholars do not introspectively critique own efforts at decolonizing, not only will the project fail to evolve in the necessary direction, but it may unwittingly derail into either having little impact or even perpetuating that which we are seeking to undo, end quote. With these formulations in mind, let us pause and direct attention towards ourselves. I want us this morning to do a reflection and reflect on and by turning the gaze towards us as academics. Studies have shown that where there is insufficient conceptual clarity, introspection, and reflexivity, intellectual decolonization can have limited impact on dislodging coloniality, not only with the effort of academics, but also which resides in the curriculum. To appreciate this call to soul searching in the process, let me illustrate by citing, for analytic purposes, two strands of intellectual decolonization. The one trend of reasoning relates to this process that puts emphasis on urging African scholars to liberate themselves from colonially caged mentality by stopping to cite Western scholars and replace them with African epistemology and Afro-centered knowledge. In similar persuasion, although not framed as intellectual decolonization, Asante 2020 invokes the phenomenon of epistemic hurdle with a lamentation that Africans, open quote, have rarely operated on the basis of own anchoring narratives. Theories are often those borrowed from Eurocentric writers. Africans neither have to borrow from Europe nor rent concepts from others, close quote. The other strand of pluriversality learning and posts that intellectual decolonization process should be open to including whichever research, ideas, theories, and concepts are suitable, regardless of where they originate. In consonant with the perspective of Mignolo, 2007, the notion of delinking understanding to lead a decolonial epistemic shift that brings to the fore other epistemologies and principles of knowledge and understanding. It is a process which recognizes that Western foundations of knowledge is on one hand unavoidable and on the other highly limited and dangerous. Both approaches are intricacies that I cannot go into in this talk. The main point here is that whatever decolonization theories and practices that one favors and implements, there is a need to constantly evaluate and adjust as necessary. Now, what happens when intellectual decolonization misses or glosses over the essential ingredients or which Maldonado, Torres, and Musavi warned about? We need to understand the unintended consequences of decolonizing the curriculum. Research by Hay in 2021 has shown that where there is a lack of understanding of decoloniality and reflexivity, the decolonization process can suffer unintended consequences, which include A, maintaining the status quo, and B, reinscribing Eurocentrism. And how does this happen? It happens when we continue to maintain the status quo while claiming to be decolonizing. Babu and others study demonstrate how decolonizing the curriculum can elude even the most avid of decolonial practitioners. The authors trace this challenge to the nature of given a planned or university curriculum, in particular that they call the null curriculum, which necessarily excludes other topics or epistemologies. Given this reality, the difficulty of imagining a formal curriculum which is totally inclusive of all marginalized epistemologies, even that was the intention. How far can an academic successfully decolonize when in actual fact The very fact of exclusion sustains the status quo in the same way as mandated by the approved curriculum. It can also be maintained, the status quo, by reinscribing Eurocentrism while claiming to decolonize. Closely tied to inclusion-exclusion debate, there's a subtext that underlying canons that can guide decisions. It is argued that in westernized university system, such as that we have in South Africa, representations of the dominant academic model is based on a Eurocentric epistemic canons and a Western-centric starting point. Mbebe 2016 writes, open quote, "A Eurocentric canon is a canon that attributes truly only on the Western way of knowledge production. It is a canon that disregards other epistemic traditions. It is a canon that tries to portray colonialism as a normal form of social relations between human beings rather than a system of exploitation and oppression," close quote. Mbembe's postulation shows, on the one hand, how reinscription of Eurocentrism and sustenance of coloniality takes place even when trying to implement some decolonial actions. On the other hand, it brings to the fore the fact that attempts to achieve curriculum pluriversality, that is, one that consists of ecologies of knowledge, Western and previously and non-Western, may not succeed if university itself and wider society are not decolonized. In the light of complexities around intellectual decolonization and possibly unintended consequences, how then should we proceed with the project to mitigate the identified impediments? The foregoing discussion demonstrates, among other things, that if coloniality in the curriculum is to be successfully dislodged, then the praxis enacted must be holistic. It must go beyond what is taught and how it is taught across disciplinary hierarchies to encompass the entire process of management, access, and governance systems in sites of knowledge production, which is what we are doing as this management, I hope. In other words, in this project, following Ndlovu-Kacheni's contention, we face a bigger challenge of how to change the very idea of the university from being a university in Africa to an African university. Why? And this is why at the University of Zululand, we crafted a vision and a mission to turn the institution into an African university, which is known for African thought in form and content, characterized by among key features. One, centering of Africa as a legitimate epistemic site, a locus of insinuation from which to see and experience the world, thinking from where we are in Africa as part of epistemic disobedience consisting of rethinking, thinking. In line with Ngugi wa Thiong'o's formulation, reconnecting with the buried alluvium of African memory that must become the base for planting African memory anew in the continent and in the world. Beyond the planned curriculum, we also have to interrogate the hidden curriculum, which is where colonialism is hidden, by the way, which has been shown to contribute to insidious maintenance and reproduction of epistemic violence and injustice. It does this through entrenched colonialities in a form of invisible, unwritten, implicit norms, practices, attitudes, values, and infrastructure or structures that shape the pattern of social interaction between social actors within the institution. In short, as Maldonado Torres declared, decolonizing the curriculum is never pure nor perfect and must not be seen in terms of, I quote, a full picture of a decolonized institution, society, or world can be. No one can assume to have all the relevant questions or all the relevant answers that would lead to decolonization, close quote. In conclusion, I would like to add that there is no one correct way to decolonize the curriculum. Given different and evolving understandings, strategies, and contexts, with what said, let me leave you with this, a parting shot by quoting Mignolo and Walsh in 2018, who stated that, open quote, decoloniality is a practice-based, action-oriented, ongoing process that is a praxis as a walking, asking, reflecting, analyzing, theorizing, and actioning in continuous movement, contention, relation, and formation. With these words, let me wish you a robust deliberations, and I thank you. Thank you, Program Director.
You know, the Vice Chancellor never ceases to amaze me. The investment in reading and investment in reflection always comes out. And VC, I've taken a position of saying, beginning today, I'm going to put together all your introductory remarks into a book. And in any country, and if you had the powers vested in you, this would have been a policy prescription to all academics, to all members of staff. Thank you very much for provoking us as you always do. And I think in doing so, you have laid a very good foundation for the next presentation by Professor Elolwani Romogondo. But before calling him, I need to indicate that somebody had said that we should, or it was Kacheni, that when you introduce somebody, you must talk about the person, the identity, and all that. I'm going to resist that. And I'm encouraged by the Vice Chancellor, who has actually said we need to sophisticate our approach to scholarship, to thinking, and that there are some traditions that you should not dislodge, that you can also use to your advantage. But it would be remiss for me not to indicate that here in Professor Ramugondo, we have a scholar of decoloniality. We have a scholar who is steeped also in occupational therapy. And I think most of us need that therapy. And I will be sharing with members of staff a very brilliant article that she wrote. And I shared it with Professor Brown, who, instead of sleeping, he was ecstatic to tell me at 2 o'clock in the morning that this is a very brilliant piece. And the piece is really about occupational consciousness. But all I'm saying is that even after she has presented, you should Google her, go to Google Scholar and type her name. Then you'll be very much informed. Presently, Professor Ramgondo occupies a very critical position, which also speaks to her orientation, that of being the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Transformation and also Student Affairs. But I thought this last one was very important, social responsiveness, which is really what we talk about when we talk about an African university, a university that is responsive, a university that serves the purpose of identifying the social and economic and cultural challenges of African people and respond to those challenges. She does not come here without a lot of experience. Previously, she was the deputy dean for postgraduate education in the Faculty of Health Sciences and also the chair of UCT's Academic Freedom Committee. And she also served as an occupational therapist in South Africa, our country, and also in the United States. I do not want to bore you with a CV which is readily available. But for now, I'll call Professor Ramugondo to come and guide us on the topic of decolonizing the curriculum. Because without decolonizing the curriculum, what we've been doing is simply a talk shop.
Okay. So I have the slide up, but I won't need it right away. So I will stop it for now. And if I need assistance, I'll call you back to assist me. Sanibonani. It initially felt strange to feel at home, but this morning I've decided to claim that it is actually quite fitting that I feel at home. To have stayed at Empangeni and now at KwaDlengezwa, both African names for places. For a South African, for us Africans, it shouldn't be something that we wonder about. But it doesn't stop there. In meeting my sister this morning, Prof. Mtose, I picked up that we are aligned completely. And the introductory remarks, both from Prof. Mtose and Prof. Siepe, again confirm that I am not lost. I am at exactly where I need to be. So again, greetings, and I will declare that protocol has been observed in case I make a mistake when I try acknowledge everyone who's here. But I must extend my sincere gratitude to have been asked to give this prestigious lecture. Thank you, thank you. Prof. Siepe, for the role that you've played as well as the program of this series of lectures. Thank you. I also wish to thank Lungelwa Mangai, who's worked very closely with my colleagues at the University of Cape Town to make sure that the logistics work out for me to be here. So you have been told that occupational therapy is my background, that I come from the health sciences. Perhaps some people might ask already, coming from the health sciences, what right does she have? to speak about decolonizing the curriculum. Isn't that for people in the humanities and the social sciences? But if I do a good job, also conscious of the fact that UniZulu currently has no faculty of health sciences, then through this lecture, you will realize that what all of you do in your respective disciplines and faculties intersects with health in one way or another. And that if UniZulu in the future were to be interested in introducing a faculty of health sciences, that it will have to be conceptualized very differently from what is the norm here in South Africa and in the global South. So yes, perhaps you do need therapy from CFA, all of us. But if it is occupational therapy, it would be a very different kind of occupational therapy. So the title is Decolonizing Curriculum. And having listened to both Professor Mtose and Professor Siepe, I'm very confident to tweak it a little bit and say it's about decolonizing curriculum or the academy, because both are intertwined. You can't do one without the other. I also wish to preface this paper by indicating that I will be making references to two people who've become very close brothers of mine, and that is Professor Mokgobe Ramose and Professor Ramon Grossvogel, two individuals worth reading together because there's a lot of synergy in what they've written, to a point that as convener of the University of Cape Town Decolonial Summer School, I have, after great efforts, managed to bring these two individuals together to make it very clear that decoloniality and mutufatso are two sides of the same coin. Decoloniality, on the one hand, involved with a lot of undoing and unlearning, and mutufatso being about humanizing, an active process, which links very closely to what I am going to say. So I have framed the paper I'm presenting this morning along three questions. First one being, what is knowledge ultimately about? The second question being, why is it the case that we seem to have forgotten what knowledge is ultimately for? And lastly, the question is, how do we remember what knowledge is ultimately for? Now, starting with the first question, what is knowledge ultimately about, which is a teleological question. I am here to remind you that the ultimate purpose of knowledge creation is about understanding life and living. And I take this from the origins of philosophy. So if you take Mesopotamia, for instance, and this is approximately 2,100 years BCE or before Christ, and with the work of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where themes of friendship, morality, and the human condition were explored, or ancient Egypt. This is 300 years later, where philosophical reflections contained reflections on nature, the universe, gods, and humanity. But for us in Africa, this doesn't surprise us even now, Because when you read Ramose on the African philosophy through Ubuntu, it becomes very clear that indeed philosophy ultimately is about being human. So I am again reiterating that I am here to remind us that knowledge is ultimately about understanding humanity, life, and living well. But humanity, life, and living well are about health and well-being of all things in harmony. So if things are so clear, why is it that we seem to have forgotten that knowledge is indeed about life, living well, and well-being? I argue in today's paper that we are made to forget that knowledge is about life, living well, and well-being through three mechanisms: the fragmentation of the knowledge project, disciplinary decadence, and colonial lies that are embedded in the disciplines. Now let's start with the first mechanism, the fragmentation of the knowledge project. It cannot be overstated that the modern university emerged from disciplines in service of the state in the global north, with Africa and her needs deemed irrelevant. So I concur completely with the mission that the University of Zululand has embarked on to make sure that our needs in this context are critical in shaping the kind of academy that we build and what we bring in our disciplines as part of decolonizing the curriculum. Now, to confirm that indeed the modern university or the modern westernized university is made up of disciplines in service of the state and in the global north, I have Reben Sofar to quote, who wrote in the Historical Journal in 1988, and I quote, "The emergence of the modern university, at least of Oxford, was informed by a prevalent agreement that new subjects must provide a discipline in both the widest and narrowest sense for transforming immature young men into responsible and capable leaders at home and within the empire. High-minded teachers worried about a future far less certain than the past expected university graduates to choose influential careers that would preserve and perpetuate England's unique political and cultural heritage. So knowledges canonized in disciplines in the westernized university are premised on dominant interests that are served. Much of this universalized knowledge is also fragmented, with disciplines often driving theoretical and methodological fundamentalism. And we see in that in the universities of today, there's a preoccupation with specializations. And in the health sciences, we see life itself increasingly atomized, reducing life to the basic components of molecules. So that is the first mechanism, the fragmentation of the knowledge project. The second mechanism through which we are made to forget what knowledge is ultimately about is disciplinary decadence, which is defined by Gordon Lewis as failure to appreciate reality, which sometimes takes the form of recoiling from it. And I quote, "This is the phenomenon of turning away from living thought, which engages reality and recognizes its own limitations, to a de-ontologized or absolute conception of disciplinary life. The discipline becomes in solipsistic fashion the world, and in that world, the main concern is the proper administering of its rules, regulations, or, as Fanon argued, self-devouring methods. Becoming right is simply a matter of applying as fetish the method correctly." Close quote. Eloquently put, but devastating. At a benign level, this is a vanity project. Ego at the center. Knowledge, or the knowledge project, in the image of white men of 5 countries, as Ramon Grossfugel puts it. And these 5 countries being Italy, France, England, Germany, and the USA. Tying to what, again, our Professor Ramose saying about the spurious claim that Aristotle's man is a rational animal and nobody else. My former and late colleague, Professor Harry Garuba, would often speak about traveling disciplines. And in the work that we did at the University of Cape Town as part of the Curriculum Change Working Group, and through our engagements, we found that traveling disciplines indeed carry along with them both a colonial narrative about the origin of knowledges, as well as a colonial authority about how they should be constructed and who should be their custodians. In that way, context should not matter. Reality should not matter. Lived experience should not matter. When with that, the right to observe is curtailed, along with a low tolerance for questions that matter. At a more sinister level, disciplinary decadence is about disciplines serving colonial interests. And this takes me to the third mechanism through which we are made to forget what the ultimate purpose of knowledge creation is about: colonial lies embedded in the disciplines. And I have grouped these colonial lines along 3 areas: the doctrine of discovery, being human as a given, and third, the ability to think without the body. First one, the doctrine of discovery. This notion is strongly embedded in the narrative of science and Western civilization as the triumph of humanity. Even though what explorers from Europe called discovery had a counter-narrative for indigenous people everywhere, who called it simply occupation. Second, being human as a given. It turns out that being human is not a given. Otherwise, how do we reconcile with the fact that the same year that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights occurred, apartheid was founded in South Africa? To really get to understand how this comes to be, we have to take a historical perspective and not see this coincidence as happenstance. This can be linked to what happened with the 1552 Valladolid trial of the School of Salamanca. This commissioned by the Spanish imperial Christian monarchy, where we had two, don't know whether to call them scholars, people of the cloth, but they were trusted with leading a debate that will settle a question that empire was concerned with. On one hand, it was Ginés Sepúlveda, who argued that when it came to the Native Americans who were wrongfully categorized as Indian, that these were people without a soul, and for that reason could be enslaved. On the other, you had Bartolomé de las Casas, who argued that no, these people have a soul, but they're in need of Christianization. Bartolomé de las Casas wins the argument, and of course it means that Native Americans, or Indians as they were called, could not be enslaved. But what was the consequence of that? 300 years of Africans who were captured and brought to the Americas, North America to be specific, because they were deemed to not have a soul. So what we see as the beginning of religious racism in saying, well, you may have a soul, but until you convert to Christianity, you're not a fully deserving human being. You see color racism and ultimately anti-Black racism, which continues with 1652, with the arrival of the Dutch to the tip of Africa, and what we see towards 1948 happening. Because to the world, Black people were not human beings equally deserving of everyone else. So there is a big difference between declaration and action. We can declare all we want, that to be human is a given, but what matters most is what people experience in their everyday life. And again, Prof. Ramose puts it aptly in this way, and I quote, "For the African, human rights discourse, which is clearly a negation of this fundamental philosophical principle, feta homo, utshware motho, shall remain a powerful declaration of intent with little import in the everyday life of the structurally impoverished." And this is where I want to share the slide, and I'm sure I will get the necessary assistance I need. Because we have to remind ourselves of what Fanon said in 1952. And this is around the racialized line of the human, above which we find whiteness, below which we find blackness, the zone of being above the line and the zone of non-being below the line. Above the line, we find that humanity is recognized. And this happens because oppressions are mitigated by racial privilege. And the materiality of domination is through regulation and emancipation. Below the line, where we find blackness, humanity is not recognized because oppressions of any kind are aggravated by racial oppression. And the materiality of domination is through violence and dispossession. The consequence of all this is that above the line, you find hyperhumanization, where whiteness becomes the epitome of humanity. where absolute rights exist, whereas everybody else below the line of the human faces premature death. With Ramose again saying, the colonized have only one natural right, namely to submit or die. Now, it might seem like I'm exaggerating until you see examples. So you will note above the line a story we are all familiar with. Protest at a magistrate court in Senekal, Free State, South Africa. Protest against farm matters allegedly targeted at white Afrikaners, or should I call them Amerikaners, and beneficiaries of apartheid and settler colonialism. Whiteness, even above the state, symbolized by a white man standing on a police vehicle. Below the line, again, a story we are very familiar with, where the state response to mine workers when protesting for wage increases at the Lonmin Platinum Mine results as the Marikana Massacre. So, what I'm saying about the materiality of domination above the line as opposed to below the line is not a figment of my imagination. There are stories that show that this is informed by concrete realities. But why is this so easy? And why does this continue? To help us understand that, and I was very pleased to listen to my sister, Prof. Mtose, talking about her work around racism. Because understanding what racism really means is critical if we are to decolonize the curriculum and the academy. Grossfogel's definition is also very helpful, where he defines racism as the global hierarchy of superiority and inferiority along the human that have been politically, culturally, and economically produced and reproduced for centuries by the institutions of the capitalist, patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric, and modern colonial world system. This definition is important because it highlights four aspects about racism. It politicizes racism by foregrounding unequal power relations involving a dehumanizing dynamic. Secondly, it historicizes racism by recognizing its long durée origins and evolution. Thirdly, it emphasizes racism as systemic. It's too easy to focus on interpersonal relations and call racial slurs, for instance, the hallmark of what racism is. Seriously, think about it. If someone calls me a monkey today, is that going to affect the trajectory of my life? Given the position I hold? Clearly not. But it is at a systemic level that my trajectory and of others like me can be interfered with. And it doesn't stop with us, it continues with the next generation. But we are often kept busy with this interpersonal relations or slurs. Lastly, this definition, although it includes the factor of pigmentation, it also acknowledges that it doesn't stop there. And that's why it is possible to have racism even when there are no white people around. So we have to really understand the importance of seeing racism at a systemic level. And to make that point even clearer, I present a metaphor which you may be familiar with as well, the spider web, to depict the systemic nature in which racism manifests. It's important to think of these phenomenon racism as systemic because it points to a set of things working together as parts of an interconnecting network as a complex whole. So in the metaphor, the threads of the spider web that hold the whole entire system intact, the capitalist, patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric, and modern colonial world system, the institutions that are politically, culturally, and economically produced and reproduced, and in turn produce this global hierarchy of inferiority and superiority along the line of the human. Structurally, it is about the arrangement of and relations between the parts or elements of this complex network. And in terms of structure, it helps to think of the spider web radius. So starting from the anchor and how far the spider web goes in terms of reach. And this is along unequal power relations that confer absolute rights only to one segment of humanity. For example, the right to ownership of means of production, land, also the right to existence and therefore optimal or most advantageous self-defense. These are the embedded logics that inspire and justify coloniality. Land is critical, and there's a reason that people are fighting to the end to preserve their right to ownership of land. And that's why people will run all the way to the center of empire, the US, to make sure that that right is protected. And when we insist that that should change, we become enemies number one. These embedded logics that inspire and justify coloniality happen the way they do because we have geopolitics at the center. And what then happens are these different types of industrial complexes, such as the military industrial complex, the pharmaceutical industrial complex, and the prison industrial complex. And that's why you will find in prisons all over the world a certain kind of criminal. It's not just because you have white people who hate black people. It is systemic. It reproduces itself. Institutions are the spaces in between. And again, at the center, geopolitical institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, with banks at the periphery. Other institutions are education and the media. And I mean, there are many examples of what institutions refer to. Again, geopolitical institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank are a very important example to point to, especially for us in South Africa, because our currency, the rand, gives it all away. If you think about it, comparing during apartheid and now, what explains the fact that from 1928 to 1990, this is 60 years, the rand-dollar exchange is 2 rand. 60 years. And then what happens after 1994? From 1994 to 2025, 30 years, the rand moves from 3 rand 53 to 19 rand. I mean, we're hovering close to 19 rand. What does that tell you? Does it mean that the dollar hates democracy? The dollar loved apartheid. So it shouldn't surprise you that the GNU becomes that buffer in its current configuration against a rand that otherwise will be on free fall. So when I listened to Solim Simang the other day on SAFM saying, no, there's no invisible hand controlling the DA. The ANC must just follow through with agreements on reforms. And I'm like, really? And this is someone of the same complexion as me, but silent about the demand by the DA for the expropriation bill to be canned. You see, the right to ownership in terms of means of production, including land, and the right to existence is conferred to only a segment of humanity. The minute you tamper with that, you will suffer. But what I'm also insisting is that global geopolitical institutions determine what happens economically at the institutional level and linked to structural aspects of how racism is systemic. All right. I'm going to move now to the third lie and the last lie, colonial lie embedded in the disciplines, the ability to think without the body. A key fallacy that has endured empiricist perspectives in the social sciences, including African studies, is the possibility of thinking without the body. This fallacy rides on the coattails of a long esteemed goal for the Western-led pursuit of knowledge to yield universally agreed upon truths. René Descartes is credited with being the father of mind-body dualism based on his seminal work, Discourse on the Method. And of course, a dictum that you know very well, cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. But Jerry Jennings argues that this dualism emerges as a byproduct of Descartes' original goal of establishing what should count as knowledge, which is an epistemological question. The problem starts, however, when Descartes posits that there are two distinct entities, the thinking mind and the body, to be understood separately before one can understand how they interact. This ontological preconception about the mind and the body existing as separate entities laid the basis for the method Descartes adopted in his phenomenological analysis of rational thought. When examining his own mental state, free from the influence of real-life sensory experience, imposition by authorities, particularly the church, faith, and human habits of poor thinking, Descartes experienced mental existence as acute self-reflection. He then formulated a set of qualities that necessarily defined mental being or existence as non-bodily, episodic, and autonomous from external influence, having different modes and able to recognize itself as engaged in various mental acts. For Jennings, it was the method Descartes adopted that ultimately precluded him from understanding thinking as a continuum of conscious awareness ranging from the full clarity of understanding to mental experience that is barely aware of itself. in adopting a strict method that required him to experience mental existence as being fully attentive and self-aware, Descartes contradicted his own observation that real-life experiences and feelings, such as pain, hunger, and thirst, reminded him that he, the essence of who he is, did not only reside within the body as a pilot in his ship, but that he was ultimately intimately connected with it, the body, and that the mixture is so blended that something like a single whole is produced. So Descartes proclaims, I think, therefore I am, when in fact he was facing internal contradictions. But notwithstanding criticism, Cartesian dualism continues to pervade the pursuit of knowledge. So there I've mapped out how we are made to forget the ultimate purpose of knowledge and what those mechanisms are, ending with the colonial lies that are embedded within. The third question, how do we remember what knowledge is ultimately for? And my argument is that we do that by addressing the fragmentation of the knowledge project and disciplinary decadence and disrupting colonial lies. So addressing the fragmentation of knowledge, of the knowledge project and disciplinary decadence, and disrupting colonial lies as the hallmarks of decolonizing the curriculum. And I want to posit that it starts with asking the questions that matter from observation and experience in context and transdisciplinarity to seek the answers. By doing this, Ramose says we can reclaim our inalienable right as Africans to reason as, and I quote, means to an end, namely the authentic liberation of Africa, close quote. This university is the node of African thought. Why is it so difficult to understand? So I really celebrate the boldness with which the leadership of this university insists that it shall be so at UniZul. And I want to say that research becomes a tool to disrupt knowledge fragmentation and fostering transdisciplinarity. The questions that we posed as the Curriculum Change Working Group at UCT, which proved very threatening to some, are simple. 4. First one, what are the dominant paradigms that influence research methodologies and development? Yeah, so you deal with fundamentalism, especially around the method, as fetish. 2, what are the gaps and absences that prevail and what do these signify? And here you can refer to De Souza Santos, Third, do our research endeavors respond to challenges in the Southern or African context? Why is that a problem when we pay attention to the challenges we face? And lastly, and this is where I liked what you said about Africa as the site of scholarship. So rather than merely serving as units of analysis, in what ways do African challenges provide rich sites for theoretical production and solutions to local issues as well as global challenges? So I'm going to share some examples in my own work and from those who draw from my work to show that these things are very important to show through what we do. Because decoloniality cannot only be discourse if we are serious. It has to show in what we do. So you would have picked up that It's very difficult to put me in a box as a scholar. And it starts with the concept that Professor Siepe made reference to, occupational consciousness, which is a construct that emerged from my doctoral work. The study explored intergenerational shifts and continuities in children's play within family and investigated associated factors. The study was partly prompted by anxieties about the apparent decline of play in the post-apartheid era in relation to what adults knew of their own childhood play. Play you'd think is benign, not so. Observations in my personal and professional life as an occupational therapist echoed these sentiments about the decline of what people understood as real play. Similar anxieties are reflected in literature about British childhood at the turn of the 20th century. But the study that I explored sought to check if such anxieties in post-apartheid South Africa could be settled in the same manner as they were in Britain, where researchers concluded that rather than total decline, contemporary British childhood play was in many respects embedded in historical practices. Given South Africa's colonial and apartheid past, as well as large-scale, ongoing and rapid political, ideological and macroeconomic changes, and an accelerated pace of modernization, a study of change in children's play within family during early 20th to 21st centuries promised to yield interesting lessons about how play evolves as a human occupation and how individuals across generations within family assert agency in constructing a shared play narrative. What emerged from the study was that while play in rural post-apartheid South Africa had retained elements found in its institutionalized forms, such as games, unstructured play had become complicated, reflecting the complexification of the play narrative. This complication came as a result of Western-led social change, characterized by modernization accelerated by technology in the form of television and cell phones. Interestingly, even as adults bemoaned the seemingly lost third generation, signaling the fading away of real play as a form of cultural loss, their role in this process was missing in the narratives. Television, particularly local and American soap operas such as Days of Our Lives and The Young and the Restless, not only determined time use and the patterning of human occupations in and outside of family life, but also inserted itself into unstructured play and everyday conversation. The apparent lack of awareness about the role of television in what became play within the third generation and the accompanying anxiety about the loss of collectively shared notions of real play led to the emergence of occupational consciousness, which I define as the ongoing awareness about the dynamics of hegemony and recognition that dominant practices are perpetuated or disrupted through what people do every day with implications for personal and collective health. Unchecked, some of my colleagues are cashing in on this. Instead of picking up on the consequences of sedentary lifestyles leading to childhood obesity brought about by looking at screens, they sign these children up as patients for life. So that's where it starts with me being able to slot in many disciplines in health sciences and the social sciences or the humanities. But my PhDs also emerge in that way. One, Tanya van der Merwe, or Tanya Raouf van der Merwe, she did her work focusing on the discipline occupational therapy and treating the discipline as discourse. So she used Foucauldian archaeology and found that coloniality, social injustice, epistemological oppression, and exclusion remained mechanisms that are historically inscribed in the designs, practices, and content of higher education, and that if these historical markers are not consciously interrogated, patterns of reproduction are reified along the fault lines that already exist in society. Interestingly, she studied basing the discipline in her university, which I won't name, and at a practical level found that the professors were pretty much reproducing themselves through the students. So the practice of producing clones in line with the traveling disciplines. So this could have been any discipline with education as the academic home, but any discipline as a case study. In this case, it was occupational therapy. Then I want to refer to a paper co-published with one of the co-authors having been a PhD that I supervised. But the paper is in the American Medical Association the Journal of Ethics, American Medical Association Journal of Ethics, entitled "Why We Need to Change How We Talk About Infectious Diseases." This is by Cronenberg and Dlamini, and they trouble the use of the battle terminologies: invasion, colonization, resistance, in languaging understandings of the dynamic relationships between humans, microbes, and their shared environments. And they underscore that, and I quote, historically, the practice of modern medicine and its specialization in infectious disease are deeply embedded in and held in check by colonial thinking in Western modernity in partnership with white supremacy. And that biomedicine is not preoccupied with understanding and advancing people planet health, but arguably, at best, with preventing death, and at worst, with determining who lives and who dies. Inspired by the term occupational consciousness and adopting a decolonial historicizing approach, these authors understand why the above-mentioned geopolitical terminologies are problematic, arguing that language used in infectious disease case settings should be informed by coexistence as a guiding value of clinical and ethical relevance. And again, you're seeing transdisciplinarity here: medicine, infectious diseases, and linguistics around languaging. Another PhD, and I'm almost there, almost ending, which shows how important it is to situate concepts and our theorizing. And in this case, Mapieledi Mutimele Sibinjana focused on violence in the context of protest, because we could just think of violence as meaning the same in whatever context. She found that the Rose Must Fall movement at the University of Cape Town 2015-2016 was criticized for enacting violent forms of protest. But conversely, student activists, staff, and workers within Rose Must Fall surfaced institutional racism and patriarchy at the university as violences Black people continue to be subjected to as evidence of coloniality within the institution. The study was particularly concerned with the various ways violence manifested during the Rose Must Fall protests at UCT and the conditions that might explain how it found expression, shifting focus from the act of violence to the less investigated structures, relations, practices, and processes that manifested violence. The study revealed violence during Rose Must Fall as a process through which coloniality was applied and or resisted. And I must just remind you that with Rose Must Fall, nothing burned. Their form of protest was absolutely ingenious. Silent protests, sometimes performance, art, installations as a form of protest. Yeah. Furthermore, violence manifested as context characterized by coloniality, but as protest preceded and provoked by coloniality and as denial of coloniality. These manifestations of violence within the Rose Must Fall protests were read as expressions of colonial sovereignty. Colonial sovereignty. The consequences for participation in Rose Must Fall for the health and well-being of student activists revealed experiences of criminalization and punishment. With those forms of protest that I'm talking about, nothing burning, nothing getting broken, nobody being thrown with anything. I mean, I'm talking about Rose Must Fall before it morphed into Fees Must Fall. But as I say, criminalization and punishment followed, characteristic of South Africa's colonial apartheid history of repression of protest, calling, and this is what Mapieledi then does, she calls for a reframing of health and well-being as a synthesis of access, representation, and agency. And again, here you see health sciences, humanities, social sciences, and law coming to play. I'm going to end with showcasing very briefly the richness of our knowledge systems for health. So one of my master's students, Siwe Toto, in his work, found that there are trauma-releasing tremors in some African dance. Again, the arts and health sciences coming together. And his work has been noted by Africans in the diaspora at Berkeley University, and they want to do important work with him. And lastly, a PhD just submitted by Nkosinati Kuela, who's looking at Ngoma consciousness as existing and accessible tools for healing and therapy in Africa. Again, the arts and health sciences. So, to conclude, we are made to forget what knowledge creation is ultimately about. The mechanisms are clear, as I've mapped out. We must address the fragmentation of the knowledge project and disciplinary decadence, and we must disrupt colonial lies. And it starts with giving ourselves permission to ask questions that matter, informed by what we observe every day, our experiences in context, and we are not bound by the disciplines where we find ourselves. In transdisciplinarity helps us get there. Thank you.
Yeah, ish, ish. You know, Professor Song, we were schooled here, né? You listen to the two speakers, you even, I'm no longer sure that I could say I'm educated. It looks like I still have to go back to the library and deal with the concepts that have been put to us. And what has been beautiful about the two speakers is their ability to signpost where they are going. And I think, Prof, your signposting in terms of the questions was very important to anchor and really to also assist academics that as we decolonize the curriculum, we need to ask the fundamental questions and also assisting us in terms of what are the strategies of doing that. And in a sense, it would seem that you and Professor Mtose were somehow connected in some form that I can't explain because both your papers speak to each other. But it's not only about providing the concept that anchor what you're talking about, but also to say what is to be done. That after all is said and done, it comes on to what can be done. So I fortunately these presentations are recorded. They would help us to go back and as I would from here to come and to go and listen to them carefully so that I feel empowered. It bothers me when some of our people may not take advantage of the technologies that make this possible. Because at the University of Zululand, the VC had taken it upon itself to say, if we are going to be talking about being a node for African thought, then we should be very serious about it. That every academic at this university will have to go through that course. It's amazing how easy we are drawn to Western education, and we have no problem in getting certification. The certification that leads to the miseducation of African people. You know, Professor Vilagazi, who incidentally was a professor here and was crafting a center for African thought, made the simple articulation of the challenges of South African education and African education that when an African becomes educated, they become Europeanized or Americanized. But when a European becomes educated, they remain European. When the Japanese get education, they remain Japanese. It is only us where we think education is about distancing ourselves from ourselves. So your presentation today and that of Professor Mtose serve as an antidote to that. But mine is not to respond to you or to the Vice-Chancellor. We have somebody who's willing and eager and capable, who can't wait to get here. Professor Brown.
Thank you very much, Professor Siepe. Yeah, I could wait to come here. I certainly could allow you to carry on. Um, let me begin by acknowledging the Chair of Council, Professor Mabunda, our VC, Prof. Ntosi, our distinguished speaker, Professor Ramugondo, and other distinguished colleagues in the audience and those online. I chose to wear my glasses today. Normally I just read because I think it's quite crucial that I capture a couple of things that have been said. I have the exciting but challenging task of responding to the thoughts of two dynamic speakers on a topic that is quite dear to my heart, the curriculum. But before I get into that, let me congratulate Prof. Ramugondo, right? Professor Ramugondo on the wonderful work that you have given us with the PhD students that you were supervising, as well as your work in the decolonial committee at the university. I think we should give her a big round of applause for that. And I promise you I'll get your name very well as I go along. Ramugondo, right, that's it. In the interest of time, Professor Sepe, I will draw some ideas from both presentations. And in this regard, while I was sitting there, I pick up 3 or 4 fundamental thoughts or insights from that for me run as a thread through both presentations. And I do identify with these thoughts, but towards the end of what I'm going to say here, I will also raise a question. I know you don't like me to ask questions, but I do have one that I think maybe it's a rhetorical question in the end. I think The Vice Chancellor set the scene, as you mentioned, Professor Sepe, quite eloquently, as we have come to expect of the Vice Chancellor. She laid everything bare, stripping away all the illusions about what the curriculum is or is not, and showcased in all its form the plan or formal curriculum, the hidden curriculum, which she mentioned as the unintended curriculum. And I want to add the other one, the informal curriculum. Each, of course, different and each influential in their own right, but they are not separate elements. They coexist, they are wrapped up as one big ball in the educational environment, even though one have a way of casting a very long shadow over the others. The plan curriculum has this way of casting a very long shadow over the others. But the key for me in the Vice Chancellor's presentation is the call to action that she put on us. We are, as academics, called to be agents, intellectual decolonization. That put us in the middle of the whole process of decolonizing, but start with self-reflection, self-criticism, introspection. Intellectual decolonization is a call for us to be showing agentic capital. We must act. We cannot proceed without first ensuring that we are cleansed. And I think I remember previously exorcism was mentioned in one of your talks. And that is what came back to mind as you were laying out the foundation in terms of calling us to do this introspection and self criticism. And so, in this whole process, we have come to locate where we stand in the curriculum. The hidden curriculum, the unintended curriculum, is carried by ourselves. The values, the attitudes, the beliefs, and all the other things that the Vice Chancellor mentioned, those are carried by us, the implementers of the curriculum. And so the introspection is quite important and crucial, that we do that self reflection and see where we stand in relation to our intellectual decolonization. So that's one of the key concepts that came out. And as Prof. Sepe mentioned, there were other concepts, and I think we will walk away with quite a number of them. And I, just for the sake of playing on words, I will mention a few others. Traveling discipline. Did you hear that one? Traveling discipline. It's my first time to hear that one. And I thought, oh, interesting. Traveling discipline. I remember the peripatetic academic, the traveling academic. Now I hear this traveling discipline. And I thought that was quite important for us to not leave here bearing in mind. The other one is hyperhumanism. Hyperhumanism that Prof. Ramugondo mentioned. And I thought those were quite interesting concepts. And I'm sure you have captured others in your own reflections and thoughts as you go through. Let me go into the first theme that I find coming out from the presentation. This issues around the curriculum versus knowledge. One of the threads, as I mentioned, is that the curriculum, which the Vice Chancellor emphasized, contains the knowledge which Professor Ramagondo called attention to in her presentation. So you see the link between the two. I do not think anyone here would disagree that the formal curriculum is the overtly chosen or planned teaching and learning activities of education of the educational experiences that we give students. Nobody would disagree with that. Nobody would also disagree that the effectiveness of that curriculum hinges on the knowledge that is imparted and on also the knowledge that knowledge is organized and how that knowledge is organized and delivered. A knowledge rich curriculum focuses on subject specific knowledge and skills, which aims to foster intellectual growth, or as Professor Ramagondo mentioned, develop deep understanding. That's the purpose of knowledge, as she emphasized, deep understanding. So that knowledge is contained in this curriculum that we present to our students. But this curriculum is not value neutral. It is value laden. And those of us who are students of curriculum would remember these things from back in the days, right? My second theme is that the curriculum that we seek to decolonize is an expression of two things: the knowledge of the powerful and of powerful knowledge. Professor Romagondo, your entire presentation could be summarized by these two expressions because much of your concerns have been about the knowledge of the powerful and the powerful knowledge. Cartesian dualism continues to pervade the pursuit of knowledge because that approach is reflection of the knowledge of the powerful. See, we still remember Descartes because it's the knowledge of the powerful. The doctrine of discovery persists because it reflects the knowledge of the powerful. The notion of a social pyramid wherein the black race is placed at the lowest rung and are seen as non-beings, while the whites is privileged at the top of the pyramid, as you were showing on the slides, persists because of the knowledge of the powerful. The knowledge of the powerful is about who creates the knowledge, its origin, and whose interests it is protecting. Powerful knowledge is characterized by its specialized nature, its coherence, and its ability to extend the horizons of students. The fragmentation is being maintained by the creators of the knowledge because it gives them power and control. So you mentioned the fragmentation as a way of causing us to forget the purpose of knowledge, but it's deliberate. It's not by chance. The briefcase or traveling discipline is very intentional. It's not by chance, and it is being maintained for a particular reason. And I know I identify with quite a few of the things that you mentioned. Decolonizing the curriculum is an acknowledgement that the powerful knowledge and the knowledge of the powerful in our curriculum are not in alignment with our ontology and our epistemology. So I can identify, and I do share the view that the systemic, the structural, and the institutional level of racism is really what we also need to pay attention to. It's not just located in the curriculum, but across the entire processes of the university. And I think you mentioned that quite clearly in that diagram. The key here is the colonial matrix of power. And until we disrupt that, we'll continue to fight ourselves. So using curriculum to produce clones is itself intentional because it is sustaining a particular view. So that's the second key theme that I thought came out very strongly, the issue of the knowledge of the powerful and the powerful knowledge in relation to the curriculum. Ways of knowing, as you mentioned, Professor. Thank you for reminding us to think of the social world through what I'm going to draw on a European, unfortunately, through the John Dewey's ontology. John Dewey's ontology argues that reality does not exist as separate with the fixed objective reality on the one hand and the multiple subjective reality on the other hand. It doesn't argue like that. Rather, it supports the view that these realities are mixed and are bonding in some cases. It stresses, or he stresses, existential reality, or us interacting with our environment, our world, the earth, and gaining the experience from there. And out of that should come the knowledge, as you would agree. But as Kaplan in the mid 1960s mentioned, we must construct a framework to respect all ways of knowing or carrying out inquiry because it promotes the plurality of knowledge. If people in the physical world wants to inquire based on fixed objective reality, allow them to do that. But knowing there is limits to what they can understand or explain. This should be the spirit that we take as we approach our inquiry. There are multiple ways of knowing. If they operate in a deontologized, so I should have said deontological framework, let them. But knowing its limitation. And I'm talking here specifically to what Descartes he was arguing, and also what we argue in relation to our approach to methodology. I agree the decolonial project requires emphasis on Afrocentric cosmology. African knowledges are inseparable from Afrocentric cosmology. And Professor Asante was here. He put forward Afrocentrism as a theory to drive the decolonial project. And I still believe that that is where it sits. And I think you do agree from the arguments you put forward as well, that, and even from the student projects, you could see that you are centering the African experience in all of what is happening. That is the theory of inquiry that should become center stage in research methodology. Afrocentric cosmology is a new class holding together the African value system. And I know Prof. Shakani would identify with that. It's holding together our Afrocentric value system, philosophy of life, social conduct, morality, folklore, and the like. All of these. So That way of knowing and those questions that you raise are very important in terms of the methodological issues that we confront. But within research, and this is something that we are encouraging our researchers to do, to pay, to centralize or to make center stage the African experience. And once that is done, there's no way that our research would not be responsive to our context and so on. So that's the strong points, and we really thank you for reminding us that we really should pay attention to methodological issues. And it's a good reminder to our colleagues who might even not be here present with us when they listen to the tape later. Afrocentric experience is quite crucial. Let me turn on my final point, well, second to last point on the curriculum decolonizing versus repurposing the curriculum. You raised the point, Professor Ramugondo, about knowledge, about what knowledge is about. You said it's about understanding life, humanity, living well, which is good. I never thought of it actually. It's a very interesting perspective. I haven't thought about it in this particular way, but I just wonder what colleagues in the physical science who operate in what I call the physical world, not as opposed to the social world, would say about that. And here I'm drawing on the idea that pragmatists think of knowledge from a utilitarian point of view, how that knowledge helps the pragmatist to achieve his or her purpose. And so he doesn't attach meaning to the knowledge until when that knowledge is applied. And then that, if it applies and it works, then that becomes knowledge. If it doesn't work, you throw it away. And but like I said, I've never thought about it this way. I need to go and think about it some more as well, to say it's about life, understanding life, humanity, health, so and all of that. Very interesting perspective. Knowledge is justified true belief, and it can be produced via multiple sources. Scientific research is just one of those sources of knowledge. And of course, it's the traditional way of knowing still exists, and we still believe in it. My takeaway from this point, though, is that if we are to properly educate our children or youth, we must be very clear about what the purpose of the knowledge is. And the purpose of the knowledge that we assemble as the curriculum, we must be very clear about the purpose of that knowledge if we're going to assemble it as a curriculum. To appropriately target that education for Blacks, we must begin with a discussion of the purpose of education. Whose purpose is it? As you rightly pointed out, the colonialists propose purpose education in the curriculum deliberately. And you captured that point around when you were talking about the fragmentation of knowledge. During the apartheid period, and when you read the Welsh report in 1936, written in 1936, let me just share a line, Professor Sepe, about what the purpose of apartheid education was. It says, the education of the Black African child is to prepare him for a subordinate society, whereas the education of the white child is to prepare him for a life in a dominant society. So the purpose of education is quite crucial in relation to how we approach our teaching and learning practice. The current purpose of education, as captured in the White Paper on Education 95, says, and among other things, to prepare citizens to be cogged in a machine. I'm paraphrasing. To become workers to fit in industry. One of the lines that I picked from there, it says, to develop the development of human resources, preparing them to participate in the economy in economic activities. Those are direct quote from that document. But when the long and the short of it is to prepare citizens to become cogs in the machine, the wheel of a machine. It is difficult to locate and to grow decolonial projects and agenda in an education system that is not explicitly aimed to prepare the oppressed and marginalized Africans to liberate themselves from the imbalanced condition in which they find themselves, or to prepare them to handle power and authority with skill, or further, to lead life in a dominant or egalitarian society where they can safeguard their survival, solve their own problems, as you mentioned, uh, through research and other things, plan and safeguard their own education and so forth. In other words, repurposing of the curriculum should be the main goal. Once repurposed, everything else fall into place. The knowledges, the pedagogy, and all those methodologies and so on that we talk about. The education of the colonizer and the colonized African cannot have the same purpose. The colonizer did not suffer oppression or marginalization and related disadvantages. They do not have the same problems as the colonized Africans. Sorry about that. I'm not sure if I'm too long, but I'm just done, almost done. So I'm going to close off in terms of uh, my reaction by looking ahead, and I call this a scratch head situation. So in the context of today's discussion, Professor Sepe, should we be trying only to decolonize the curriculum, or should we be trying to repurpose the curriculum alongside our efforts to decolonize the curriculum? See, that's why I said I'm going to end with a question. But very interesting discussion, and I thought we are making great progress. Thank you very much.
I said he was eager and able. Now, thank you very much, Professor. And I also think that when you ask the question, it is not simply because you want it to be answered immediately. It's more about saying, let's think aloud. You are still thinking aloud in the same way that you're still going to consume those parts and that those aspects where you say, I never saw it that way, you know. And in the same way that Professor Ramugondo did indicate how people can start anchoring concept differently. I mean, the concept of violence. When people talk about violence in the brutal sense of what the police are going to do, as opposed to systemic violence that young people are exposed to on a daily basis. And also the miseducation of Africans. Africans, I mean, going back to your university, it's interesting that the most educated Africans who led that university saw nothing wrong about the statue of Rhodes. I even suspect that they took pictures proudly, but they took young people who had not been sufficiently colonized to say there's something wrong with a celebration of somebody who caused so much mayhem on African people. It was only after that some people said, but what about other symbols of oppression? But it took young people. But one could say maybe they escaped that level of colonization. But as you say, we need to start looking at concept differently, even the concept of what does violence mean. I've seen with my own eyes what Jesse Jackson called the violence of poverty, where I met a young fellow who kept on talking to me with such great respect. And when I asked him how old he was, he told me he was only 39. And yet he looked so old. But it was the violence of poverty that he was exposed to. So the notion of violence need to be reinterpreted, and we need to look at and look at the systemic violence that our students face on a daily basis when they come into the classroom. I would want to open this to a few questions from the audience here, or even comments. Are there any takers? Remember, if you ask a question, there's a possibility that the VC might think of promoting you. Eh, One, oh, Professor Mtose, looks like the members of staff here are very comfortable with their positions. Or can you read the comments for me? Let me see. Oh, yeah, the first comment. Oh, the one is says Nyabong. I think the person was talking more about himself herself, but I'll assume that it's a Siabong. We are all, Excellent presentation. I enjoyed listening to you, madam. Thanks for the thoughtful webinar. The other comment says decolonization of the mind and thinking model that we are told to use. We need conscious effort. I think this is directed to the VC. And then second, trusting and hoping the recording of this timely event will be shared publicly. Yes, it will be shared. I've been assured. The other one is education and othering process. It's a question to you, to both of you. Or I see it to Professor Ramugondo. That question is education and othering. And the other comment was, thanks for the presentation, and it provides direction on decoloniality, on how decoloniality can be integrated in transforming our curriculum, which is what this whole thing was all about, to say, now that we've spoken about this, what are the mechanics of doing it? That question again on, after all is said and done, what is to be done? And I think you've provided that by signposting it with the questions that should guide us. But for now, maybe you could comment briefly on that question. Is education another form of othering?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You know, and again, I made reference to how Prof. Ramose and Prof. Grossfugel write in ways that are very synergistic, and it's particularly around Descartes' notion of who can think. And Prof. Ramose says, and Ramon also says, the woman was not in the mind of Descartes when he said what he said, women of all races, but also the African was not thought of. And, there's a lot about being spoken for the rest of us. So when you go into a university where you don't see yourself, clearly othering as an outsider is created through education, through miseducation, as you rightfully put it. You become someone that gets rewarded when you are assimilated, which means that you are not wanted as you are. You have to strip who you are to become that which is seen as the epitome of humanity. And the way we speak, the accents that get rewarded. I mean, students will tell you. There are students who do well in historically white universities because of the way they speak. You have a heavy accent, especially from this continent, is seen as a handicap, when in fact, our languages, the fact that you already have a language from this context, should already be social capital. It should already be social capital. It took a while for people to get what I was saying in health sciences, that it makes no sense that the more we started having students in the health sciences, MBCHB, all the health and rehabilitation professions, students who come from the context where the majority live in this country, that we still run assessments in English. Can you imagine? Think about this. Perhaps the patient has a mental illness. How do you properly diagnose someone whose language you don't recognize? How dehumanizing is it when the student speaks the same language as the patient, yet they must communicate in English for the benefit of an educator who doesn't speak the language? It's violent. And when such student fails, we don't ask ourselves what's gone wrong. There's a lot that I could say, but I don't want to expose my employer, the university where I work currently. But I'm glad that there are those who recognized what I was saying. But again, it took scholarship. One of my PhD students, Matumo Ramafikeng, who looked into this language as a barrier that is created to continue reducing the intellectual efforts of our students who speak African languages. I mean, the fact that many of us speak 7 languages, surely by the time we get those results in matric to get into university, that should already count. But yes, othering is what we still face, where our languages are not seen as currency, as part of the intellectual project. Does not make sense. But there's been very good work also at UCT, where the Anglo-normativity of Western University has been called out. And it's been very good to see some of our white colleagues seeing the importance of that work, because it's Caroline McKinney, who picked up on this dominance of English as hugely, hugely problematic. Othered through language, othered in many ways. And to add injury to salt, alongside the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, you had Sarah Bartman, the sculpture of her in the library, with chains around her neck and her ankles. Why would you do that? where young Black women of all complexions walk through every day. You're reminding them that that's who they are and that's what they deserve at a library. And people didn't get it. The same time when the statue had to be removed, again it was young women who went and clothed the sculpture. And people didn't understand. Some in management who thought that it's an insult to art. And you think about it. If, and I won't mention her name, the individual who was murdered by her boyfriend, right? Won't mention the name. Imagine a portrait made and hung in the library as an expression of art. Would that be acceptable? Of course not. So why is it acceptable? Just because it's a Black woman reminded of who she is and who she can be. So othering through miseducation is as clear as daylight.
Prof, thank you very much for bringing that continuous assault on certain bodies. You know, you have in this country a celebration of a denigration of African people, and it's called art. And the people fail to understand why we require. But it goes back to what Fanon says, that there's some people have been declared to be subhuman. And part of the dehumanization finds expression in what is considered to be art, what is considered to be education, including not people living in this country, not seeing it as their responsibility to even learn any of our languages because we exist to serve them. Our duty is to make ourselves understood, as opposed to them trying to say, if I'm in this country, I will learn at least one African language. And yet, when they go to Europe, to places where there's French speaking, they spend hours learning the French language because when they go to France, they know that the French are not there to serve them. So, this notion of decoloniality is very serious. It is personal, it's historical, it is really about who we are. And we should get to a stage where if this is an African university, Africans must behave as Africans. Actually, the and that comes down to ensuring that we transform our curriculum. That the transformation must ultimately be a statement on the curriculum, because we know, as Ngugi put it, that colonization, one of the things that it did, as Biko put it, that the greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And colonization, what it did was to target the minds of the colonized and to produce a type of intellectual and academic who will be beholden to colonization. The type of a Black person who prides himself or herself that I can speak better English or better French than my own neighbor. I mean, I grew up in a world where if I went to a party, I would saying contra principia negantem despita dam, and people will clap. And while nobody understood what I'm saying, but this is what uh, Carter Woodson wrote about when he talked about the miseducation of a Negro. And I think I'll end this by quoting what he says. He says, if you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his action. When you determine what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself about what he will do. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. If you make a man think that he is justly an outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there is no back door, his very nature will demand one. Unquote. So when we talk about decolonization, it is what we mean. And finally, and perhaps more pointedly, when we talk about the decolonization of curriculum, we are saying it is a project that will center on three things. One is to unmask the Eurocentric negations of African people. Second is to reverse the erasure and the silencing of African voices. And thirdly, it is about undoing the distortions of African realities. With those words, ladies and gentlemen, Vice-Chancellor, members of Council Online, our guest speaker, I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to navigate this space and to open myself to the education that we've received. With those few words, may I call Professor, the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Research and Innovation, who is eager to come here and able to say a word of thanks.
Thank you, Chairperson of the webinar, Professor Siebe. The Chairperson of Council, Professor David Mabonda, and other members of the University Council who are present online. Our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Xolisa Mtose, the executive and all the management of the University of Zululand, our renowned guest speaker, Professor Ramugondo, colleagues, students, and all the participants attending this webinar here in the venue and virtually, greetings. It is my pleasure to propose the vote of thanks for this discussion. Professor Ramugondo, we are deeply grateful for the thought-provoking and enlightening presentation you've delivered today on the crucial topic of decolonizing the curriculum, also you said also our academy. Thank you for the challenging us to consider the factors that needs to be distracted in order to decolonize the academy or our curriculum. And also I like your emphasis and also your, in fact, you've demonstrated to us how research can also be the driver of decolonizing the academy. Please accept our sincere appreciation for your outstanding contribution to this important conversation. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Brown, for your thoughtful and insightful response to our guest speaker's presentation on decolonizing the curriculum. We appreciate your comments and reflections. Thank you for your thoughtful analysis and actually subsequently the food for thought that you've given us on, or a question on whether we need to repurpose the curriculum. Thank you. I would also like to express our sincere gratitude to the leadership of the institution, our visionary leader, the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Mtose, for championing the promotion of the African thought in our institution. Your commitment, Vice-Chancellor, to making UniZulu the node of African thought has created a transformative impact on our academic community and your leadership. and has encouraged thinking of indigenous knowledge. It has promoted African perspective in the current curriculum, although still working on that development, as well as promoting research initiatives focused on African solution. As mentioned also by the chair of the program, our institution is making significant strides in promoting African thoughts. Thanks to all your efforts, Vice-Chancellor, and thank you also for the valuable information and the guidance you have given in the opening talk. Sincere appreciation to our chairperson of the webinar, Professor Sipho Siepe, and the organizers, especially Ms. Lungelwa Mankai. Thank you for ensuring that we get these webinars, which are very encouraging, and they keep us glued on this project of promoting UniZulu as the node of the African thought. And thank you to the communication department and the ICT team for ensuring the seamless execution of our webinars. And your attention to detail always makes the difference, including the mic. Thank you all, participants, colleagues here in the venue and online, for all the valuable comments that have been made on chat as well, and for you to be here for listening. I'm sure you are still thinking about what needs to be done next. And thank you very much.
That's it, folks. You can vamoose.